Hi, this is Sergio Melnichenko with the Brazilian Hour. I would like to invite you to join me every week with the best and most exciting music of Brazil. Every week, right here.
Tune in the Brazilian Hour every Saturday night at 11 on KSJE Farmington.
How do you know what to make of the news? Is it politically inflected? Is it stenography? Is it just plain untrue? On the Media helps you decode the news. We reveal the process behind the story because there's sometimes as much to be learned from the gathering as from the news itself. Please join us.
Saturday mornings at 7 on KSJE Farmington.
Mr. Detweiler, we're all finished.
What?
Your knee replacement went great, and it's all because of you.
What did I do?
You were captain of Team Detweiler. You told us everything. Medical history, allergies. You asked us tons of questions.
Huh. I guess I did kind of run the whole operation, didn't I?
We couldn't have done it without you.
Patient safety. It takes a team. A message from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons with more tips at orthoinfo.org/patient safety.
Thane Maynard here. The 90-Second Naturalist is a compact little radio show with expansive goals to raise awareness and improve understanding of the natural world. To do this, we take just 90 seconds and present stories about the plants and animals around us. The facts are fun, the sound effects are neat, and the host ain't so bad either. Please join me for the 90-Second Naturalist.
Listen every weekday afternoon during the KSJE Evening News at 5:30. KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, here to meet your urgent and emergent medical needs, whether they are COVID-19 related or not. Medical emergencies happen when you least expect them, whether it's a stroke, heart attack, illness, or injury. San Juan Regional Medical Center's caregivers are here to provide care to you and your loved ones. Find out more online at sanjuanregional.com. "11 minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, June the 3rd, 2021. Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Michlin. Thanks for tuning in to KSJE, 90.9 FM over the air here in San Juan County, New Mexico, 103.3 FM over the air in Durango, Colorado, and of course streaming everywhere on the planet from our website, ksje.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this visual radio program. The video is streaming live this morning to the KSJE Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our Twitter account. So we're glad that you're with us however you found your way here this morning. Welcome aboard, everybody. A great program up for you today. Coming up in the next few moments, we are talking about ancient diets and health. Archaeologist Paul Reed will be joining me, of course. He works with Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, and he is bringing with him a very special guest this morning. Dr. Karl Reinhardt will be joining us, too. He is a Fulbright Scholar from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Done a lot of research on this topic, and we'll be talking more about that in the next few moments right here on KSJE. Then, of course, at 9 a.m. next hour on our social media platforms, it is our weekly COVID-19 Community Information Program. Megan Cullip will be joining me here in Studio A. We'll be talking with Matt Bieber from the New Mexico Department of Health about the continued vaccination efforts across New Mexico and something new, a sweepstakes to encourage more folks to get the vaccine and reward other folks who've already gotten the vaccine. So that's coming up, all the details about that. Also, we'll be talking about mental health, of course, which is always an important topic, especially around COVID. Dr. Amber Layton will be joining us as well coming up this morning on our COVID-19 Community Information Program. Again, it's live streaming at 9 a.m. on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. A rebroadcast on the radio this afternoon, of course, at 5:06 p.m. right here on KSJE. On the radio at 9, Mick Hess is going to be here, our classical music program, Roving with the Arts. Mick is playing more music from composer Max brunch coming up this morning today, 9:06 on KSJE. And don't forget, we invite you to connect with us on our Instagram page in addition to our other social media platforms as well. Outside our studios this morning at San Juan College, 68 degrees with sunny skies. We are on our way to a mostly sunny day today with a high of 86 degrees, although we could see some increasing clouds this afternoon and maybe a shower or thunderstorm popping up this afternoon in some parts of the listening area. 86 for a high, as I mentioned, maybe a scattered shower overnight with a low near 60 degrees. Mostly sunny, warmer on Friday with a high of 90 tomorrow, a low of 60 again Friday night. For the weekend, highs in the 90s once again, 92 with partly sunny skies, a chance of an afternoon shower popping up, 60 degrees overnight, and then, of course, 90 again on Sunday, and an overnight low of 56 with some partly cloudy skies. But almost sounds like a monsoon pattern shaping up, but we'll see if we get any showers out of this or not. Let me turn to my guests who are joining me this morning. As I mentioned, a very exciting program planned for you this morning. Paul Reed, of course, always wonderful to have him back with us from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins. Paul's joining us remotely this morning. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back.
Good to have you back as well. Thank you very much. And our other guest this morning, as I mentioned, Dr. Karl Reinhardt is here, Fulbright Scholar from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Dr. Reinhardt, it's a pleasure to have you on KSJE this morning. Good morning.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Scott. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Carl.
Good to have both of you with us, and thank you both very, very much. And let me start by talking a bit about Dr. Reinhardt's research, and it is somewhat unique, I would say, Dr. Reinhardt. You deal with coprolites, and for folks who may be not familiar with that term, maybe give us a little better definition of your field of study, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, coprolites are geologically termed fossilized species. And they have been a source of information about diet and parasitism for many decades. And so there have been a long series of researchers who focused on these in various parts of the world to define how ancient people ate and what parasites were eating ancient people. And I think those are the two major goals traditionally. And more recently, in the past 5 years, they've been a window on the gut microbiome to understand how recent diet in the last 5 generations or so have changed the gut microbiome and caused diseases of industrialization that we all face to one level or another in the modern world today.
Right. Very interesting. And so these samples that you look at and study are certainly, what do we think, 800 years old or plus?
800 years old or plus. The oldest samples that I've worked with are from Dust Devil Cave, which are archaic samples. If my memory serves me correctly, they're 7,000 years old or older.
Very good. And Paul Reed, let me bring you into the conversation, because I imagine maybe there are folks that are thinking that it's maybe surprising to find these samples still around after all these years, or near some of these ruins, or things like that folks wouldn't have buried them deeper, further away, or what have you, from where they were living, working, and sleeping, I suppose.
Yeah, I think for modern folks, that might be a little perplexing in terms of sort of the waste disposal issue. But, one of the things that's remarkable about the places we talk about a lot on the show, Scott, Solomon Pueblo, the Pueblos up at Aztec, Chaco Canyon, certainly, is the size of these sites, the multi-story architecture, and then, over the many centuries, the infilling essentially created dry cave-like settings in certain, particular rooms at Solomon, Aztec, sites across the West, certainly in Chaco. So what we end up with is, a great preservation environment, especially at depth in these rooms. One of the rooms at Solomon, room 62, produced, I think, a quarter of all the coprolites, and that's because the room was very large, very deep, and essentially didn't get wet and didn't have that environment where bacteria grow and, digest and do their work.
Right.
So really this parallelism between deep sites, and they don't have to be pueblo sites as long as there's, deep deposits, and then the cave sites that people think of more typically as preserving these kinds of remains. And so I think what's really exciting about Carl's work is he's been able to compare the large open, Taco and Great House sites to sites, Antelope House and Canyon de Chelly, and a whole bunch of other settings. So it's really exciting work.
Very interesting. Thank you, Paul Reed. And Dr. Reinhardt, let me come back to you a little bit about kind of looking at these coprolites and what you learn from them, because I would assume a lot of the data can't be found anywhere else from this period of time. It's not like they were writing things down in a diary or old refrigerator to look through. I mean, this is really a treasure trove of information, is it not?
It is, and one of the benefits from the parasitological perspective, I came into this as a parasitologist initially in the early 80s. The dietary work was dependent on that because in those days people didn't think Native Americans had parasites in prehistory. But going to the parasitology, we can find the most delicate parasites in these coprolites, and therefore for the Americas we have a better idea of the spectrum, the number of species, and the paleoepidemiology of parasites, because we have this wonderful preservation. With regard to dietary remains, there's more variability in preservations. The dry cave sites have excellent preservation, but sites like salmon ruins, the coprolites actually became calcified, so they're really, in a true sense, coprolites as fossilized species. Because of that, I've had to develop some extra methods to recover the data from salmon ruins to make those data comparable, as Paul mentioned, to Antelope House in Canyon de Chelly or Antelope Cave up near the Virgin River in northwestern Arizona.
Very interesting. And so from this research, Dr. Reinhardt, you talk a little bit, we can certainly see from other research about what foodstuffs were grown or stored at a lot of these sites and things like that. But are there any other maybe surprises that you have found in your research about diet and then I guess by extension then health? Because you talk a lot about parasites and things along that line, that some of that was a bit of maybe a surprise to you.
Well, if looking at the health is a interesting question, because my own perspective was influenced by my father, who was a diabetes researcher with Native Americans. And so in the 80s, he thought it was fascinating that I was exploring this, because his hypothesis was that diabetes was due to a change in diet rather abruptly over a 3-generation time from traditional foods in the southern deserts of Arizona, like mesquite, prickly pear, native fruits, native grains, to a modernized diet. And so when I've looked at that phenomenon from the northern reaches of the Sonoran Desert, you can definitely see that the dietary reliance on mesquite and prickly pear, desert succulents like agave, were a constant up until the contact with Spanish. And for certain, the elimination of those, or the reduction of the use of those foods in modern times, to have them replaced by fast food, highly dense carbohydrate foods, fatty foods, certainly contributes to the emergence of type 2 diabetes. And in a broader sense, I think that can be applied to not just Native Americans, but we have in many populations in the modernizing world a problem with diabetes, obesity, and that sort of thing. One of the interesting things that's coming out of the gut microbiome work is that there is a beginning awareness that certain bacteria are, in the absence of those bacteria, are associated with autism. In prehistoric times, there was a presence of more species of those bacteria associated with autism. So one of the things that's emerging now is beyond looking at metabolic disease, like diabetes, we can begin looking at questions of concern relating to topics like autism, which for me is absolutely fascinating, that so much information related to our modern health can be derived by these ancient coprolites.
Very much so. And I wanted to share with our viewers, at least this morning, an article from Indian Country Today about your work, Dr. Reinhardt, that talks a little bit about, as you just mentioned, the diabetes, and we know what a big problem that is for our Native American communities all across this continent. And it certainly talks about your work and that maybe it could look for a possible cure to this epidemic among Native Americans and possibly others if we look back to, as you mentioned, maybe some of the origins of this problem as the diet changed, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the cure is an interesting word. I think in the world today, cures are very, very hard to achieve, rare. However, control is a more common approach in the world today in dealing with our health problems. And I think that ultimately the control of these problems relates to changes in diet. And that is a hard thing for most of us to accept.
Understood. And I think most medical professionals would agree with you, but that is probably one way to at least move in the right direction. So very good. My guest this morning, archaeologist Paul Reed, of course, from Archaeology Southwest and the Salmon Ruins is here. Also, Dr. Karl Reinhardt. He is a Fulbright Scholar and a professor at the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln are joining me this morning talking about Dr. Reinhardt's studies of ancient coprolites at sites near and far, I would say. Your work takes you all over the place, Dr. Reinhardt, and not just here in the San Juan Basin, I suppose.
It has. So I've worked in Brazil for 22 years, and also in Peru and Chile. However, since 2015, I've decided to return to the Colorado Plateau to rework and reevaluate the questions I had when I was a young scholar in the 80s and 90s. So I'm coming back, and Salmon Ruins, where I excavated as a very young man, and Aztec Ruins were two of the first places that I applied for permission to analyze coprolites.
Interesting. Well, we look forward to your return and what you find out with the passage of some years, maybe. And let me ask you a bit about any evidence of different diets, I guess, for the folks who lived in these places. Is there any evidence that maybe the more elite members of these societies had a different diet, a better diet than maybe the folks that worked in the fields or built these places or things like that? Is that or would that be just hard to determine?
Well, with the data set we have now, it would be hard to determine. However, I think our increasing awareness of coprolites among archaeologists will enhance our ability to recover various samples from various different types of sites. I'm very happy with the Aztec ruins analysis and the current Salmon ruins analysis because we looked at 3 different rooms and came up with 3 different diets. And that is fascinating to me. Room 219 and Aztec ruins has the highest number of squash flowers being eaten of any ancestral Pueblo site, of which there are 20 or 30 that have been studied. The highest consumption of squash seeds, and the highest consumption of beans, but not beans in terms of the seeds, but rather bean leaves. That is a diet that I think is more related to medicinal use. The second room, room 225 at Aztec Ruins, is a diverse diet, but has a lot of maize-derived foods, so that what Aztec and Salmon but especially Aztec room 225, is showing that people really enhanced maize production to include collection of maize pollen, which was eaten. There is a sort of mushroom called Lustilegomatus that was eaten in Pueblos today in historic times. In Anglo culture, we call it corn smut. In Mexico, it's called huitlacoche, but it's a very, very nutritious food that comes from a fungus, a mushroom that grows on the corn. And then I'm looking with my colleagues at different ways of preparing corn starch. So it appears at this point that we have evidence of fermented maize as well as ground maize. And just as I was finishing this analysis, there were papers published on how maize that's processed to make pozole looks under the microscope, and I do believe we have some evidence of pozole. So room 225 is showing us a use of maize that is diverse, and clearly people are extracting as much nutrition as they can from their maize. I think that kind of diet would indicate more of a high status group of people. Salmon is just amazing from two perspectives. We're talking about sanitation, and by my inventory of the collections, there are 27 grid squares from room 62 that Paul mentioned that are represented mostly by coprolites. I estimate that there were some 12,000 coprolites that were recovered from that room, and many more undoubtedly were left by the archaeologists because they were too fragmentary to collect. But what does that tell us? It tells us that this is the only room that had a latrine that was used by large numbers of people. And I do believe what we're looking at Salmon is a ruin that was, or is a village town that was a focus of large regional gatherings where people came to spend some days, perhaps some weeks together, and therefore it was necessary to set aside a single room as a latrine. So, and in that case, we have more ground evidence and also processed evidence of maize. So, and also a flour made of lamb's quarter and goosefoot, plants we call Chenopodium and amaranth. So it's a very, very different diet than either of the Aztec ruins diets. So I think for the first time, to approach your question, in this analysis of Aztec and Salmon, we're actually approaching differences in diet. And I was so happy to see that as the data began communicating to me what was going on dietarily at these sites.
Very interesting. And I think what strikes me is that they're so different, and yet those two sites are relatively close together. To have such different maybe diets or chefs working on creating different types of food or using the food differently.
Well, I was impressed by that, and Paul can correct me if I'm in error, but my impression from this analysis is we're looking at Aztec and Salmon as one mega population interacting with each other in a fairly large sphere, and people in that sphere gravitate to Aztec and Salmon ruins for gatherings. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're seeing some of that. You know, I also think we have just a lot of people in residence at both of these places. So, you know, I do think that the research definitely shows this diversity of food resources that, you know, came out with some of your early work, Carl, and then work that Karen Adams and others did on the macrobotanical. And just, you know, we tend to, I think, overly generalize sometimes ancient diet and talk about the big three, the corn, beans, and the squash. But it's clear that there's a huge diversity of natural plants that came in as diet, and then, as you mentioned earlier, Carl, as medicine and fulfilling other needs. So, yeah, I mean, this is particularly interesting, Scott, and as we've talked in prior shows, this is another, pretty high-tech analysis that we're bringing to bear to really older questions about how folks lived, the foods they ate, and what their lifestyle looked like. So, this is, again, one of the things that makes this period of time doing archaeological research just super exciting, because we have all these different technological approaches to come to it. And Carl, one of the things that I find really groundbreaking about your work is you're constantly seeking new methods to extract, other bits of information to work into your narrative about how people lived. So, again, Scott, not to pat us on the back for the science, but this really is how science works. We're constantly seeking new information. We get little bits of data. It sends us in this direction, or maybe we go off and something doesn't work out quite the way, we anticipated, so we go off in a new direction. But yeah, this is, again, really exciting work.
Indeed. Well, and you have taught me over the years, Paul Reed, that, there are always folks out there who may challenge some of these results and some of these findings, and the fact that you can defend it and back it up with the data is what makes it stand, I guess, the test of time until something new or different comes along. Paul Reed, I wanted to ask you, too, about your work. You've worked a lot at Salmon Ruins, of course, and so do some of these findings that Dr. Reinhardt has published and shared give you a better interpretation, or maybe make you want to go back to maybe relook at something at Salmon with some of this new information now that Dr. Reinhardt is sharing?
Yeah, it definitely does. And, this is one of the things that I think we see sort of contrasting periods at both of these places, because the earlier period, of course, from, sometime towards the end of the 11th century, late 1000s into the middle 1100s is pretty Chaco dominant at Salmon. And then the site goes through a transition. The architecture that was very Chacoan is opened up. It looks like there's a lot more freedom for different groups, families, lineages to modify the architecture. And then, post 1150, 1175, 1180, Salmon starts to build up to the largest population that it has. I've estimated that by 1220, 1230, there's probably more than 400 people living at Salmon Pueblo. This contrasts with probably less than 200 during the peak of the Chaco period. So we're seeing in the 1200s, in the 13th century, people gathering in larger and larger numbers. And, what Carl was talking about, these central places on the landscape, these large Chacoan great houses that then evolve into post-Chacoan, community centers. Great pueblos is one term we have for them. Aztec, of course, is on a different trajectory with 4 great houses up there, built between, say, 1060 and, the late 1200s, and just more and more and more people there as well. So, again, I think that the diversity that Carl's research is showing in the plants, the plants being consumed and used is just great, fascinating information that we can bring to bear. I do think that as central places, that these sites are pulling in people from outlying communities, and that's really what we see initially in the Chaco period, with people coming up from Chaco to found these big places. Salmon at about 1090, Aztec at slightly later at 1100. But, even with the transitions, perhaps some of the turmoil with the Chaco and, collapse and decline, we still have lots and lots of people treating these areas as, these are the places on the landscape to be. And, I think there's a lot more we can learn about that.
Right. Very interesting. Thank you. And Dr. Reinhardt, let me come back to you a little bit and ask you about your research. Is there any missing pieces, missing things, or data that you would like to find that would help maybe answer a few of your questions from all the work that you have been doing?
Yes, there are. As I mentioned, this question of pozole, of nixtamalized maize, came up just as I was finishing this research. So I think going back to the residues that have been processed, to look at the alteration of starch, determine whether starch is being fermented, whether they're eating pozole. Those are questions that I still need to examine. The Salmon Ruins coprolites, this is the third analysis I've done with them. and the preservation was not so good. So I need to return to those and evaluate them further to draw out as many dietary details that I can. But my biggest question is, I have not seen in these two sites, the Aztec ruins west and Salmon ruins, I haven't seen winter foods. All of the foods that I'm looking at now have pollen that would indicate they're being the samples are deposited in spring, summer, or fall. I'm curious as to what was going on in winter, and hopefully, as time goes on, collections will be found from places where the winter diet would occur. As Paul mentioned, and as you mentioned, natural resources, from my perspective, are the foundation of dietary patterns going back 7,000 years. And certainly they persist in the Puebloan times. In Antelope House in Canyon de Chelly, we had fairly distinct patterns of diet for the winter. And I just wonder what people were subsisting on with regard to natural resources in Aztec and Salmon area. So those are a couple of questions I have relating to these specific sites.
Interesting. Very good. And I guess we're almost out of time this morning, gentlemen, but last question, Dr. Reinhardt. In 800 years, when future archaeologists are looking at our coprolites, will they be amazed that the species even survived our horrible dietary patterns these days?
Well, if humanity listens to the data coming out of the gut microbiome work, I think archaeologists in the future will see 100 years in which we turn to fast food, and carbonated beverages and concentrated sugars, and then wisened up and moved back to a more healthy, high fiber, low fat, low glycemic index diet. That's what I hope they do.
Oh, me too, hopefully. Very good. Paul Reed, any thoughts about future archaeologists and what they will think about our society in 2021?
Yeah, I like Carl's optimistic vision.
Right.
I hope we will pass through this now, roughly century old. Hey, it's great. Let's have convenient foods. One of the things growing up, in the 60s and 70s, my mom loved cake mixes and things that made cooking so much easier. And, it's because she had grown up, in the Depression, and you had to do everything by hand. There were no mixes. The food was certainly better from our perspective, but it's interesting how people's views of convenience and health have evolved through time. So, yeah, I think we're circling back to a more healthy approach to things. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. And, I think future archaeologists will have plenty of other things. All our technology is, in the mix of technology and stratigraphic levels in 1,000 years. That's what I want to come back for, or
right.
Stay alive for.
Interesting. Very good. Well, very true. Perfect. Well, the pendulum keeps swinging, I guess, is what we're saying this morning. And I can't thank you both enough for joining me, Dr. Reinhardt. It's certainly been a pleasure and illuminating to hear more about your work. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share.
You're very welcome. And Paul Reed, of course, always great to have you on the program. And as you bring with you these fascinating guests, thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for joining us, Carl. Enjoyed it a lot.
Thanks for the opportunity, Paul. Hope to see you face to face.
Pecos.
There you go.
All right.
All right, you too. Thank you both very much. My guest this morning here on KSJE. I'm Scott Michlin.